Hey everybody, welcome to Transport Treehouse. I'm Russell Frost, your co-pilot. Along with me on this journey, Chelsea Sexton.
I think you're crossing analogies. I mean,
me
like you always call me the captain
metaphors?
of the ship when I think I'm more like Gilligan, but also like it's a treehouse, not a ship.
I don't really want to be the skipper. Can I not be the skipper?
Well, you can be Ginger if you want.
I don't think I'd look that good in the gown. Although I'm swear that's the professor next to me.
Well, yeah. So we do have the professor. That's one way the analogy still works.
Absolutely.
We yanked John Voelcker back because a couple days ago, Cadillac unveiled its next electric car. A week ago, they did an announcement about charging and a partnership with EVgo that we didn't really talk about here so much. And he wrote a brilliant article for the Drive on Cadillac and for Charged on EVgo. And so I basically said to him, suck it up, you have to come back and play with us again. Yank open the trapdoor to the treehouse, pull him back on.
I'm envisioning a treehouse in the shape of a ship.
I think this is where we're heading. Yes.
And what's the thing on the front? The bowsprit. So,
like the SS Minnow in the top of a willow tree.
And Russell's at the front doing the Leo DiCaprio, King of the World.
Yeah, because
there's a great story about the half-buried ship in the desert at Burning Man and the guy with 2 broken arms and a broken jaw that I'll tell you later. Carry on.
Yeah, we don't tell everything while we're recording.
Well, we'll
get Chris Payne on. He probably will. He'll tell all the stories about Burning Man.
That would be a show in itself, just Chris Payne and Burning Man.
For sure.
Yeah.
Different show, but yes.
Yeah, maybe not this show, but another show. So, Cadillac or GM, EVgo?
Cadillac.
Is that where we're going to start? Cadillac.
Well, no, Cadillac is the main point of talking. Okay. And John wrote this great article. I mean, pretty much anything John writes is really good, but especially on this breaking news stuff, which I don't do as much. I don't do the first reporting of a new car model, but if I want the facts and context quickest, John is the go-to. And there were a couple other elements that I thought were super informative and very clever in terms of how to think about this. So first, I mean, I noticed it from a styling perspective. I think they have shared very few details, but I think it's really safe to say the US is not the primary market for this car, the Cadillac Lyriq, all things IQ now going forward in the Cadillac brand. You make a very compelling case that this is a Chinese-oriented market vehicle, potentially to be built in China, at least, if not multiple places. And that, you know, we in the US need to get used to the fact that we're not the center of the world anymore.
Well, more than that, in electric cars, we are trailing the rest of the developed world. In terms of incentives, in terms of general manufacturer interest, whether genuine or beaten
manufactured
in actually selling electric cars to actual people. But, you know, it's funny, I was thinking about this in the lead up to this. If GM just answered the questions about China that you and I and other people have been consistently asking them for many months, since really the March EV day, if they just sort of said, yes, a large portion of this is for China because China has aggressive regulations and the US is one of our main markets and we're all happily playing together, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But in fact, I get the sense they're so terrified of talking about anything having to do with the world's largest car market, which is also, as it turns out, and no one realizes this, the world's largest market for the Cadillac brand. Since 2017, GM has consistently sold more Cadillacs in China than in the US, and US numbers are 60% of what they were in 2006. So this is not exactly a stunning brand story to start with. We've seen, and I went through a lot of the attempts at Cadillac redoing itself. Russell, do you remember the ad called Breakthrough?
Yeah.
Yeah, the 2 words. and with rock and roll, and people talking about Cadillac
Yes.
using Led Zeppelin were just revolutionary. It was a Super Bowl ad. It got them a ton of attention. The next year, they sold about 250,000 vehicles in the States. Last year, they sold more like 150,000. Now, since then, they redesigned their brand for that effort. They've since redesigned their brand again, their logo,
Yes.
and they've gone to a different confusing alphanumeric system of naming their cars than the first one. They did say that all their electric vehicles will have word names for the models, pronounceable, although I do have some ish. Well, but come on, you got to have some sympathy for the people who have to make this stuff up, because it has to be pronounceable in about 80 languages.
Right.
It can't have been trademarked in 80 countries, and it can't mean particularly rude things in any of 80 languages, including French-Canadian slang.
Well, for sure. Actually, I was just reading about a Canadian beer brand that got in trouble because their latest beer is named after what in Maori is slang for pubic hair. So they had
I'm
to walk
Googling that right now.
Well, I have to throw in here
all the news here on the Treehouse.
Yeah. Wow.
As someone said, I did not have on my 2020 bingo card that the former mayor of Rensselaer, New York, would be killed in the explosion of a high-pressure industrial guacamole machine.
Well, the millennials do love their avocado toast.
So I gather.
But yes, I think the entire 2020 bingo card is composed of things we couldn't have predicted.
Indeed.
Is this all tie into QAnon too?
Oh, we're never going to get done in time.
I had to invoke
back to Lyric.
Back to Cadillac
Celestic.
and brand name. So Celestic, Lyric. There were two others they trademarked, and I forget what they were now. I should have written them down. That also end in IQ.
Yeah. Well, and they debuted at the EV Day, larger other SUVs and things that will end up under that brand. So I'm sure each of those will be assigned. But yes, the whole IQ meant to be intelligence, but also something unique. And so yes, some sympathies for those that have to name these things, not unlike cosmetic colors and stuff. Like someone gets paid a lot to do that and make sure that nobody gets into trouble.
Yeah. Well, I'm fine with it being for China. They sell more cars there, great. Nobody realizes that almost all the Buicks that are on sale in the US have already been designed in Shanghai for many years now.
Right.
So, no one...
And the last plug-in car from Cadillac was made in China, the CT6.
That's correct. No one cared, but yes.
No one cared, well, including the then president of GM, because Johan de Nysschen is not known for being a huge plug-in enthusiast person, although he's come along over the years. But yeah, and so a few hundred were exported from China over here, but they have been kind of going that direction for a while. And to wit, where the Ford Mach-e, everybody looked at it and went, yeah, I see Tesla here and there and there. In this car, we see Polestar, I see Byton, I see Faraday on the back end, that there's very much some sort of Chinese, what we've come to think of as Chinese styling cues in this vehicle that really kind of suggest the primary market.
That's sort of interesting to me because I know there are two versions of the ID4. The Volkswagen all-electric SUV that are coming. There's the European and North American one, and then there's a separate version for China. It's a little bit longer and has some different accent lines. Easy enough to do, but I'm sort of interested in that. GM, I don't get the sense is going to do that unless they have two production lines for the Lyric, which, quite frankly, I can't imagine globally.
Right, and the battery plant is here.
Yes. Well, but they made a big point out of the fact that I'm betting Lyric sold in China are going to use Chinese cells that are on the approved cell list that you have to tick the box on if you want to sell a car in China. So, I think the interesting question is, do they ship rollers that have no battery packs, or do you ship battery packs from Lordstown, Ohio to China, put them in a car and ship them back?
Right.
TBD.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen stranger things, I'll say, in the EV production cycle, but that also goes to kind of the other point that initially I was like, oh God, no, that's the wrong comparison. But I think it's right. So you talked about this car being basically Volt in 2008-ish. I would say potentially even earlier than that. And at first it was like, no, well, Volt was a real car in the end, and they put a lot of effort behind it. But very similarly, when we first saw Volt, we were very dubious given the history. And GM basically spent the next 2 years trying to convince the world it was real. And ultimately, Volt was real in the sense that it was more than a compliance car. It was basically one of the first plug-in vehicles sold nationwide in real volumes for its period, and so on and so forth. So it can't be, dismissed the same way maybe the Spark could, or by extension, the Converge ELR or the CT6. What we've seen from Cadillac so far has been very much compliance cars, ELR kind of halo car. But so on one hand, I'm like, yes, it's very much in that early Volt period of GM's going to have to convince the world that it's serious in terms of volume and distribution on this car. But also it recalls the 2013 production version of the ELR introduction in Detroit, and a very specific conversation with Mark Royce in which I asked him, is this going to be a real car? Are you going to sell it in volume? Is it going to be nationwide? And he said to me, we are going to sell the socks off this car. Yes, it's real. Yes, it's going to be all the things you want it to be. And ultimately it was not.
Was that before or after the then CEO of General Motors reportedly made the decision that it would be priced not to lose money at $75,000?
Right. Yes, it became something very different. And this conversation was minutes after the unveiling of the car. Yes, things changed. To wit, the EV1 was originally a 25,000 unit a year product. So yes, I accept things change. But similarly, we've now seen 2 plug-in vehicles from Cadillac. Neither one of them have been real versus halo or compliance or whatever, not real volume, etc. So there is a little bit of that, okay, prove it, show me, don't tell me. And what struck me at the EV day was the number of PR reps who kind of took me aside and said, we know who you are. We are going to convince you tomorrow when we show you the cars that we are committed to making really good EVs. And that's great, but the reality is that's never been in doubt. Most incumbent automakers have always made decent plug-in cars. Subjectively, we like one more than another, but none of them have outright sucked as cars for what they were trying to be at their time, at least. And that's never been the question. It's the rest of the overall commitment and all these other things that led you and I to talk about compliance cars in the first place. Yeah. So what do we think this is going to be? To your point about 08 Volt, what's the tea leaves there?
I don't think this is going to change as much as the Volt did. Even though this is a show car, 80 to 85% production intent, it's not suddenly going to metamorphose in shape, I don't think.
Interior will change some.
Although they made such a point of the 33-inch horizontal screen, I think that will stay. They may not use 38-inch wheels or whatever those silly wheels were. I shouldn't say that. Whatever those striking concept car appropriate wheels were. But, it feels relatively production intent to me.
Yes.
And what really struck me, one of the points I made in the article is that under Johan, Cadillac put an enormous amount of effort into what were effectively a third generation of sports sedans. Cadillac trying to chase BMW. And I think we can conclusively say at the end of 15 years, that has not been a particularly successful strategy. Because you have 3 German makes who make varieties of German luxury, and you have Lexus, and then you got a bunch of other people who are a lot hungrier for it, the Genesises of the world and so on.
Yes.
I really don't see that anyone in Silicon Valley is going to say BMW 3 Series or Cadillac ATS or Cadillac CT.
Right. But does that change here, given the conquest sales statistic of plug-in cars in general, where 2/3, 3/4, vast majority?
Was their SUVs, which they finally belatedly rolled out to have something between the SRX now XT5 and the Escalade, the big honkin' blingy one. They now have a smaller one and a middle one. neither of which are all that compelling. They just,
Right.
they didn't get good reviews for the price. The interiors are not impressive. They're fine, they're functional, they're probably very well built. They're just not wow. And if I had to make a case, I'd say the money that should have gone in there might have gone into the Lyric. And what they're going to do with interiors, I hope, on their electric cars.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I found that interesting in the presentation, which we'll put the link in the show notes, but they talked a fair amount about, you know, going back a few years when we started down this journey with Ultium batteries and whatnot, and yet ignoring the fact that their real EV journey started easily 25 years ago, but certainly if we're talking Volt era, late 2000s, and the battery plant in Brownstown already, the Volt platform that was supposed to become a platform for other vehicles and things. And so on one hand, they've done lots of homework for a long time, and the Ultium battery strategy strikes me very similar to what happened in the early 2000s with power electronics, back when GM still had an ATV facility in Torrance where most of the power electronics work happened and much of the charging work. And sort of the end of EV1 and all of that, there were certain things that kept on going, and power electronics was one of them, because the logic was, whether it's hybrid, hydrogen, EV, whatever, it's gonna need power electronics. And so we're gonna keep going on this, which let them go much faster on Volt, because they were already, I mean, they were nearing third generation when EV1 ended. Obviously much, much smaller, more compact, et cetera, by the time Volt launched, but they were miles ahead on a really key piece of component than other competitors would have been. And this strikes me as a similar strategy of getting ready to go fast with batteries that they are wholeheartedly getting behind and whatnot. But there's still a little bit of this tone of, well, yeah, we're electrifying all the things, you know, 20 models by 2025 or 2030, but there's also a balance of this little patronization, don't worry your pretty little head, we'll give you EVs when we want to, basically. So I think some of these introductions, especially on the more premium brands, are still in this like, okay, it's a car, but how real, how many, how, you know, what's the distribution? Notably, I posted over the weekend on the social medias a picture of Mark Royce when he was asked the question that we'll get into next around, are you guys going to do your own charging network? He had some special feelings about the picture, but it was a compliment. One of the things that I like about Mark, and I know talking to many of you, he tends to be more candid than many auto executives. Andy Palmer is similar. There's a few of them that are kind of in that boat. And so just the look on his face said it all. It was one of those pictures, 1,000 words thing. And I didn't tag him, but he ended up jumping in and answering some questions. And so somebody actually asked him, is this going to be a CARB and EU only compliance car? Ignoring China, because that I don't think it was on his radar. And Mark wrote back one word: everything. And, you know, so the question was, is it just going to be compliance, or are you going to sell it all over the place? And his response was everything, which suggests that people in Kentucky should be able to get this car if they want to, whether that's a Ford Focus version of Nationwide, where technically you can order it if you try really hard, versus a Volt version or Bolt version of truly mostly in stock, remains to be seen. But I found that to be at least a little bit clarifying.
I hope it's true.
There's a lot of, I look forward to seeing that.
Yes, I've adopted that. Thank you so much for that phrase, Chelsea. Before we get to the EVgo and the charging aspect, which actually made Mr. Royce make that face,
yes.
I think the last word here, and the reason that people are so skeptical, I get this slightly, this feeling from some of the communications folks at GM who are really eager, but haven't been around and don't know the history. So they're slightly baffled and occasionally in extremis aggrieved that we don't believe that this is true.
Right.
And you rarely have time to say yes, but this is the third, if not fourth, reset that General Motors has done on cars with plugs in 25 years. And
to say, and Cadillac reset, like each of the brands has their own history.
Yeah, and you know, each time there's a thing and there are promises, and then it goes a little differently and it all gets tossed in the dumpster. And then a few years later, there's another thing, and it's going to be real this time.
Right.
EV1, Volt. Think about the plans for Volt that you mentioned.
Yes.
And I have to throw in the Bolt EV in here.
For sure.
Because one of the things that EV Day, possibly the most shocking thing to me about EV Day, is how underwhelming and uncompetitive the future of Bolt EV is for what will probably be 3, if not 4 model years.
Well, so maybe in a very telling gesture, I came home from EV Day having seen the refreshed Bolt and the Bolt EUV, and we bought this generation as our first EV we've ever actually purchased, because we don't drive very much and we get loaner cars occasionally and things like that. So yes, like next to my 17-year-old Saturn now, which I still drive, is my husband's Bolt. But I looked at everything they had coming in the next couple of years, which now has been put off a little bit more, and bought the current version. So take from that what you will.
You know, I live in the mountains and my driveway is a stream bed, as I say regularly, but if you're going to market something as a crossover, especially if you're going to call it EUV, an electric utility vehicle, there's room for a motor between those two wheels. I measured.
Yeah.
They're not
and in fairness, I mean, all of the UV editions, like, so the Bolt EUV to me is the Prius V of Bolts.
Oh, I like that a lot. Yes.
Too small.
So people who are expecting an actual utility vehicle, it's not that. It's
while Toyota
bigger.
refused to use the word wagon, they didn't actually claim the Prius V to be a crossover utility vehicle.
And I'm fine. I'm telling you that whatever GM claims about that car, that's basically what it is.
Well, and maybe even more than that, the 50 kilowatt charging, fast charging.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway.
So since it's sort of my role on the show to talk about.
Sorry, Russell, would you like a word?
No. I'll come back when you guys are done.
Come on.
No. So since it's sort of my role
to done in October, Russell. I know.
To say the obvious stuff. I mean, the interesting thing here is here's the classic American car company, and they're all very protective of their American identity, whether they're making things in Canada or Mexico or China or somewhere else. They're an American car company. So I get why GM's kind of closed mouth about this stuff. They don't want to talk about Cadillac and Buick being bigger brands in China than they are in the US, right?
Well, and in fairness, the American public and some of the politics are very anti-China.
Absolutely. Let's take it a step. I'll take it a step further. Many of GM's core customers are very much, I buy GM because it's American.
Yeah.
Right. God forbid they find out that parts of it, that the whole thing was designed in China or partially assembled in China or built or whatever.
Right.
I mean, in a sense, this is a company kind of trying to straddle that ocean and go, our money's coming from here, but we still have to maintain this identity. And I guess in their defense, that identity is important in China. If GM was a Chinese company, Buick wouldn't have the allure. Is that a fair statement?
Well, for sure,
because it's an American brand.
Yes, and I mean, you're absolutely right on that front, that the American brand or the familiar brand, incumbent brand, is a key piece of the value. And the example I use a lot is Volvo and JLR and companies that are incumbent brands, very familiar, thought of as, Swedish or British or whatever, but are really Chinese or Indian if you look at the actual ownership. And so it's sort of a Trojan horse brand. I think that's different in China in that no one who buys a Buick is thinking of it as anything other than American, versus those that buy a Volvo, many still think are Swedish. They would never imagine the Chinese background. But yes, as all of those things start to become more murky, maintaining the story is important, in fairness. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think there's a balance. If you don't have to come out and go, this is a Chinese car for Chinese people and all that, you could do something very, very similar to the Volkswagen People's Car or the Nissan Leaf, which was pretty much presented as a global car for all markets, not Chinese per se, but it wasn't like this is our American version versus our Japanese version versus our European version. We are building a thing that we think and we hope will be compelling worldwide.
especially in the arena of global luxury brands.
Right.
You know, I don't know handbags or fashion, but
me neither.
you know, those brands are equally as popular in China as they are here. Maybe the products are slightly different, but it's the brand and what the brand cachet carries. My understanding is that the two American brands, Cadillac, and even more so in some ways, Lincoln, came in later, and they were known to be sort of American in luxury, but they could define themselves as a whole new generation of up-and-coming Chinese car buyers with money without being saddled with this granddad's floaty boat aspect. Right. And Lincoln, especially, my understanding, plays on its heritage from the 40s all the way through. I don't know how they finesse the Kennedy issue, because possibly the most famous Kennedy picture associated with a Lincoln is not a good one.
No,
but
yeah.
I am told that Lincoln, the car of presidents, is a possibility for China. So they're not saddled with what it is here.
Right.
Charging.
Well, and similarly, well, right before charging, you talked a lot about Cadillac entering the market, and everyone kind of inevitably goes towards Tesla, and is this a Tesla killer and all of that. I am not sure that they're even aiming there. Certainly for the US at least, and Europe. I think of, you know, Ford, Polestar, Volvo, Jaguar, Audi. I mean, that's more the competition, especially from a volume perspective. I don't see any of this as we are going after Tesla. And yet that's the natural implication. And in China, the competitors are different, and Tesla's one, but certainly not the only one.
It's a cheap and easy headline, to be fair to my overworked, underpaid, and increasingly frequently unemployed counterparts. But
even you did some volume comparison in the article, so I mean that was the one you picked as kind of the main, you know, Cadillac's doing this, but Tesla's done this, and to not be unfair to those trying to enter the market, because not being Tesla doesn't mean you're inherently irrelevant, but it does suggest the hill they have to climb, anybody, for eyeballs and perception and brand recognition as much as volume or competition.
Except if I think the market plays out the way Chinese government industrial complex thinks it will, then in fact, it won't be a matter of choosing an electric car. Is it Tesla or is it something else? You will walk into your dealership and increasingly it will be electric cars. And so Cadillac will have as many as Tesla will.
Yes.
That is not the case here. And it gets me to my slight frustration with my valued colleagues who cover this piece of the electric, or this piece of the car industry, who are centered around Detroit, because they just don't see this stuff. And to them, mentioning the ELR being a failure is way more relevant than what I tried to bring in, even if GM doesn't want to talk about it.
Well, there is that. So back to the charging question in Mark's face. A week ago, they made an announcement of partnership with EVgo, and 2,700 new chargers on top, you know, from the 800 that EVgo currently has. So a tripling of the network, although already that math doesn't quite work out to me, because if they already have 800 and they add 2,700, that's a quadrupling. So I assume that some of that involves replacing old stuff or slower stuff. But there's a lot that's unanswered in that too. Mark did say in his answer during the Cadillac reveal that some of it does involve actual funding, but still there's not very much known about that, other than you actually did the digging on 2,700 connectors, 500 sites. So that's different than, you know, than what people would think of if they're talking about supercharger stations or something else. So from a metric standpoint, it's difficult to compare because everybody's all over the place with what they call a charger or a connector or a site or whatever. But will this be what customers are expecting from GM brands?
Well, and this, much was left unsaid.
Yes.
You know, the background here obviously is that GM for 10 years essentially said, we are not putting a dime into paying for charging infrastructure the subtext or the translation being essentially, we don't pay for gasoline. We don't set up gasoline stations. That's some other company. There are perfectly good companies and utilities and whatnot out there, not our problem.
Yeah, which I found very entertaining, to jump in for a second, because you cited the 2016-ish Pam Fletcher, like she was the one that really kind of pioneered this. We're definitely not. And Mary Barra said it too at CES. But there was a moment in time that one of the party lines was, well, we're not doing charging because we did charging during EV1. And one of the things we learned is that we shouldn't be doing charging, which I found fascinating, having been part of that. No one at GM that's there was involved so much with the charging. All of us, the EV specialists there at the time, had contractors' licenses. We were very much involved in both public and private, residential, commercial, whatever, charging. And to GM's credit, they paid for half of it. It was a public-private partnership, but really only one automaker was all the privates. It was largely like Carbon, GM, or a utility in GM, or whoever, depending on the market. And so they did invest a lot back then. And so on one hand, I get it, like it reads very much like chip on shoulder. We didn't get credit for doing that, so therefore we're never going there again. But at the same time, they have yet to wrap their arms around that entire story, so I'm not sure how they would expect credit. But we learned lots of lessons from that era, none of which I think are employed here. So that we shouldn't be involved in charging is not one of the lessons. That they shouldn't do their own walled garden like Tesla, I think is valid. And I like that they weren't, that was the question, you can do your own. And they said, no, we're going to invest in something that other people can use too. And that
especially
seems the key forward.
Cadillac. Will you have a thing to offer just to Cadillac owners that makes them feel special?
But even for all of GM, like we need to get away from everybody having their own individual networks and more towards stuff that can collectively be used, that don't confuse consumers because they don't know what's available to them.
Except, to be fair, now it is less confusing than it was 6 months ago, because Nissan, the only Chatamo folks, have essentially said, we're throwing up our arms, we're going to use the same CCS as everybody else. So in reality, going forward, for the mass market, if there is such a thing, it's CCS or Tesla.
Perhaps, although we have to consider the legacy cars, just like the old RAV4s at the turn of this particular generation. But we also had Dave Patterson on recently as he's now the North American rep for Chatamo, and he insists that it's premature, that Nissan's position is not entirely decided, that we should not read into the fact that they have made an announcement for one model, and that the death of Chatamo is, overblown and premature. So we shall see.
I look forward to seeing that.
Exactly. And Dave is known to be optimistic sometimes.
Yeah. I will go back and watch, I promise.
As hidebound as many of the bureaucracies in these American car companies, especially GM. I mean, GM's kind of legendary for that.
Yeah.
Does anybody see someone sitting at the end of the long table in Detroit and going, yeah, you know what, we're going to stick X $1 million into chargers because we need to do this to develop this market, and we're going to make them universal so that anybody can plug their car into this charger. Now, I get the revenue thing and all that, but just from a psychological standpoint, I have a hard time seeing the people that I've met that I, know what I mean? Like, go, oh, that's a great idea. Like
I honestly see this as, well, I mean, because we're not nearly as far in interoperability and different things as Europe, we could argue that there are actually several walled gardens from the major network standpoint. However, I don't see this as GM going, oh God, we think this is a great idea. I see this as GM going, we are so freaking sick of getting the question, of hearing about it, of being one of the only automakers that's not involved. Because in fairness, Nissan has invested a ton into charging. BMW, Volkswagen, there have been various manufacturers that in some form have put in their own charging at dealerships or invested into ChargePoint or EVgo or Electrify America or whoever. Subscriptions on Electrify America standpoint, no one's directly invested. The whole Ionity situation in Europe. So GM was kind of an outlier in the US in terms of an automaker who said, we are all in on EVs. We want that kind of credit as leadership. and yet we're not going near this. And that's part of the overall issue here, is that companies expect credit for press releases and announcements versus
Yes.
deployment.
Mm-hmm.
So, you
Yeah.
know, to your point about the doubt of GM, yes, that's all true. And yes, we've seen several resets. In fairness, some of us looked at the Mach-e announcement and said, I look forward to seeing that. Like, it's great, but build me some stuff and we'll talk. And we do the same thing with the startups and God, Nikola right now, but even Tesla still gets a fair amount of that on the truck side, with this, especially the semis, but kind of the Cybertruck of, like, Model 3 was less in doubt, but there's a couple models that we're still going, show me, don't tell me, stuff like that. So it's not, I mean, I think GM feels uniquely slighted, but this is no longer a GM specific situation that it was when Volt came back. They were the first automaker after Who Killed the Electric Car to announce, we're getting back into the plug-in game. And we all fairly rightfully, I think, went, sure you are. And so they went through that path. Right. And so to your point about 08 Volt, do they do that now? And the whole partnership with EVgo is really murky. They talked a lot about, well, we're going to seek other sources of funding, government and utility and grants and things like that. So how much is GM actually investing versus, I don't know, putting their name on a grant application or something? Like, what does partnership actually mean? And so that's a fair question. And ultimately, we won't know till we watch chargers be deployed. But overall, no automaker, including Tesla, has succeeded or failed totally on the merits of its EV, of its car. Building a good car is not enough. It never, ever has been for the last 25 years. Charging is a key piece. But one thing I've noticed about GM for years is we just have to build a good car, put it in a showroom, and the rest will take care of itself.
Yeah.
And so there was lip service towards marketing, but Cadillac's marketing so far was the poolside ad that got a fair amount of attention. And yes,
which, for the record, was originally written for the Escalade.
Right. But that's basically what we think of for Cadillac
so
marketing at this point.
Yeah.
And, you know, the lip service, the better dealer experience, that's delightful, not just okay, but so far we've not seen that on any of the other GM products. So there's lots that's kind of yet to be proven around the overall ecosystem that this stage of the market expects from anybody.
A handful of things. I think you nailed it in terms of them being fundamentally grumpy.
Yeah.
I get the sense that just the very existence of the question makes them sort of respond essentially, of course we're doing it now. We just told you we're doing it. And the same thing could apply to the word murky is perfect. The even murkier Bechtel announcement, which is now more than a year old. GM was going to partner with Bechtel, global construction firm, to use their trove of data about what electric car drivers do in order to, what was it? I think in the end it came down to, in order to work together to try to identify opportunities where there were, you know, sort of win-win circumstances. Yeah, for
charging specifically.
Which, I mean, if they were really starting 18 months ago again to try to figure out if there's a business model in charging, we kind of know the answer to that now, I would argue. But
for sure, at least in the near term.
Yeah. There is a paper that I have read with some interest, and I need to get more detail on it. But it says essentially, electric utilities will come to love electric cars because the net present value of an electric car in their service territory is substantial. However, fast charging is never going to make anyone any money, and someone just has to suck it up and eat the costs. I don't think the VCs funding the EVgo's of the world share that view.
See it that way.
We'll see how it comes out. But, you know, if GM has smart accountants, they may see that as well. And I get why they wouldn't do charging, because they haven't connected the dots with this ecosystem. And so, you know, I look forward to seeing the chargers. Will they do similar deals with other partners? Or is this an early indication that if perhaps there is an economic downturn and at some point the backers of private for-profit fast charging networks decide they're done, GM can pick up an asset for cheap?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I was not surprised by the EVgo partnership, given that they had done previous partnerships for Maven, and GM's invested in Lyft, and Lyft has been partnered with EVgo. If you connect the dots of the 3 primary networks in the country now, EVgo would be the obvious one. I would have been surprised if they'd gone with anybody else. So there's that. Like, it was easy. There's already a relationship there, etc. And because we don't actually know what this new component means from a dollars perspective, you know, who knows? I think ultimately, of course, there's going to be some sort of consolidation or competition. I mean, there already is competition in that. I'm also curious with this whole partnership seeking other sources of funding. The 3 primary networks are known to be very opinionated on how utilities should be allowed to participate. And it mostly comes down to, we want utilities to build all the wiring so we can come and do the most expensive part so we can come in and plop chargers on top of that and make some money. And so I'm curious to see if folks like GM join that particular conversation in what form. Because on one hand, any charger put in by anybody benefits GM and every other automaker. At the same time, if the version of their partnership suggests that EVgo should win over the others, I could see GM having a very specific opinion.
And do GM's fairly substantial lobbyists start to weigh in on the point of view that EVgo may adopt, whether it's to the detriment of other charging networks who
they already have. EVgo's
bare knuckle fighting.
Yeah. EVgo's filings read like ChargePoint's filings 5 years ago. If you didn't know who the logo was on top, it's basically the same rhetoric.
So, and as we know from a certain set of state laws on emissions, GM is not always on the side that many early adopters of electric cars may wish them to be.
Yes, well, there is that. In the CARB versus EPA fight, GM has sided with EPA, but still insists it's all into electrification. So there's a few different sort of disconnects that are yet to be really addressed from a story perspective.
And again, not to repeatedly make a bad point, but is it they're just trying to do both things? And I'm saying that are mutually exclusive, that are contradictory. Are they trying to have their cake and eat it too? Are they trying to be an American company that's made in China? Are they trying to not invest in chargers yet have a charging network that's ideally just
which is understandable?
Right. I mean, which doesn't make it good or better business, but yeah, it's understandable.
I guess I would argue that the regulatory perspective globally now, it's clear that the GMs and Volkswagens and everybody else of the world have to make a buttload of electric cars this decade, in fact, within the next 5 years, to be in compliance in China, assuming China doesn't change its mind or decide that its ultimate goal of making its auto companies, giving its auto companies the largest share of electric car production, is not being served by its current set of laws and then changing them abruptly. But if GM is going to be forced in its largest market to make a whole ton of electric cars, then by all means, throw some of them at America.
Yeah, I mean, those are the questions with all these announcements, is sort of how real are they? What does it mean? What does real mean? And to the extent that they might be real elsewhere, we continue down this path of just because it's an American automaker, just because it's a real program, doesn't mean we're going to get very many of them. And even like Ford was pretty darn blunt right out of the gate with Mach-e and said, look, we're sending 60% of year one production to Europe because they have actual standards. So there is that implication too of, you know, it's kind of up to us collectively what happens here in terms of local EV production, but also market leadership or participation at all, because where cars can be sold elsewhere, where there's a market or there's regulation requiring it, they're gonna go elsewhere. So this whole CARB EPA fight has to be resolved, or we're up to 14, 15 CARB states now. Then that might be the way that it proceeds, but that's part of the issue.
I think two things. The point you made about how throwing cars out and the rest of the world taking care of itself is not good enough is, I think, one of my my core sort of confusions with GM, because the marketing discussions I have had with them, including around EV Day, have been kind of as unimpressive as their charging discussions, in the sense that they still continue to refer to anyone who might buy an electric car as a niche market.
Yes.
That does not sort of propound hope for large volumes, or them actually making an effort to sell electric cars to more people than are buying them now. But it's a repeat of the Volt EV playbook. They had 5 years of Volt data, and when I interviewed the Volt EV marketing manager, she said, we're going to look for more people who look like Volt buyers.
Right.
Well, if you expand that, it's, oh, well, we'll have more ads to look for people who look like Volt buyers.
And yet, if you look at early Volt buyers demographically, they are Cadillac buyers. Hell, even the EV1 was supposed to be a Cadillac distribution, not a Saturn distribution, because demographically, that's who would have bought them. In the end, it went to Saturn because Saturn was more known for introducing new ideas to the public and no haggle and new materials and different things, and really high-touch customer service, which was the right decision in the end. But we're still at early adopter territory, and these are Cadillac buyers more than they are Chevy buyers, as much as we all want to get to cheap mainstream cars. So well, it's an interesting disconnect.
The comparison I always try to use was the Corvette in Chevrolet terms.
Sure.
People didn't say, I'm a Chevrolet owner. It's like, I'm a Volt owner. People don't think Chevrolet, they think Corvette.
Or Camaro.
Camaro even.
Yeah.
Well, that one may have fallen off the table. Somehow Mustang has stayed. Camaro.
You run into a Camaro owner, they don't say I'm a Chevy owner. They say I'm a Camaro owner.
Fair. Absolutely. I haven't run into very many Camaro owners of late, or modern Camaros, but
yeah, no, you're right. It's mostly older ones, but still.
So yeah, with the charging, GM has now made 2 announcements. One slightly murkier than the other. We don't know the financial details. It's great that fast charging will be expanded, and they're not doing corridor charging. So in a way, this sounded kind of complementary to the first bits of Electrify America. Filling gaps is great. It also, to some extent, I think, allows them to talk about selling to people in multiple dwellings.
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. Like that was the tenet of the announcement, is we're not doing roadside. They're doing 100 kilowatt plus, so medium fast or more. And there's not really much of only the Porsche and the Hummers in theory will use 350. So the 150 is a pretty decent sweet spot. Yes. Yep. But point being, that middle, like 100 is not inherently slow at this stage, given the predominance of models and who uses what. So fine, 150, that kind of thing, but very urban. And they mention MUDs a lot, which in some cases would make sense. There were several pricing questions that were not really addressed. So, Kathy from EVgo, the CEO, chimed in and said, yeah, the pricing is going to be about the same. We have a $5 to $15 session charge right now. We expect it'll be about the same tomorrow. That really didn't get into, do they increase pricing or do speed dependent pricing? Right now, most of their stuff is 50 kilowatt. I looked at most of the markets that they mentioned on that announcement, and 28 cents per minute is kind of another per minute so far still is about the average, but will that change when they go from 50 to 150?
Talking to other charging networks, though, my sense is that we are slowly going to move toward payment by the kilowatt hour.
For sure. And I mean, California's mandating it. And so Electrify America has an announcement coming. So yes, we will absolutely see that. But nevertheless, today's pricing might not be tomorrow's pricing, either by metric or by speed. But also the focus on MUDs and apartment dwellers and stuff. In New York City and some of San Francisco, there are places in which the demographics will support that. But
Miami. Cadillacs in Miami.
For sure, but this is not just for Cadillac, it's also for Chevy. And if your average apartment dweller that is not the rich person living in a fancy townhouse can't afford to use fast charging, you're not really solving the problem. And that overall pricing issue, regardless of brand, this is true for everybody that's going fast charging is the right answer for apartment buildings and multi-unit dwellings, that remains to be seen, because relying on DC charging full time is today more expensive than gasoline, pretty much across the board.
Yeah. Well, and it would be a different discussion if we didn't have, well, I have $2.19 gasoline, and that's in highly taxed New York. I don't know what yours is of late.
I haven't seen below $3 in many years, but we've always been $3.50, $4.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even
Well,
in like the 99-cent gas.
There are parts of America where it's $1.79 or $1.89. You know, if it were double that, it would be, I think, a different discussion. But
no, but that's also like all along we've always had this notion of does the price of gas affect sales, and it just doesn't on EVs. It does on gasoline only hybrids. But
why
for
does the price of electricity varying or the price of a fast charge varying affect? If people are, this is me being devil's advocate, but
right.
If people are so used to gas prices being up or down, in some cases by 10 to 30% over the course of a few months,
right?
Why is that a problem in fast charging?
It's only for those that only have to rely on it, who cannot charge at home, who basically can't charge at work or don't know they might be able to charge at work. But
everyone relies on gasoline.
I know. And so if you're a potential EV buyer living in an apartment and you're thinking, I might look at an EV, what's around my neighborhood in New York City or wherever, and you look up EVgo's pricing, and to the extent that the average potential new EV buyer can extrapolate per minute or per kilowatt hour prices to the price of gas, so that, you know, challenge number one is the translation and just going, oh, screw it, I'm gonna stick with gasoline. But also to the extent that you do that math and get with the nerds in the forums and stuff, if you're relying solely on DC charging all the time, it is generally going to be more expensive than gasoline. So those that bother to look at that in advance will come up with that. The other side is those that don't bother to look at it in advance find out very quickly as new EV drivers and are pissed, rightly so. And those are the ones generally that end up going back to gasoline or back to a gas hybrid or something because charging isn't sustainable, or they were talked into something at a dealer that the range is too low, whatever.
I will worry a little bit more about that when the average income of EV buyers is not where it is today. And I understand looking toward the future, absolutely. The used EV market, of course, is a different question, and it will get bigger than the new EV market at some point as cars overall. But that's probably a topic for a different day.
Yes, yes.
And speaking of a different day, we've just about exhausted our time here today. Is that
it's so easy to do with John.
I know.
Yeah, and likewise. There's a part of me that feels sorry for Russell. You and I just sort of chit-chat back and forth and grin, and, you know, there he is.
And the really sad part is, it's not just you. That's been most of our episodes so far.
It's just...
There is that.
But he's a grown-up, and he can jump in, damn it.
That's my role on this show. I learn, I listen.
No, it is not.
I have some silly thing to toss in there, like, that's all.
Well, it's the role you choose. But,
it's the role I choose, absolutely. It's not being forced. No, I wasn't going there. Come on. Not at all. But any final thoughts on wrapping this up? Do we want to, I don't mean to cut. John has something.
I would, I was spoiled because when I started in this business 15 years ago, the Volt effort was the first communications team from a major automaker that I really talked to in depth and talked to a lot of the engineers and so on. And as we know, that was an enormous anomaly. GM
unfortunately
is as circumspect, I think would be a good word, about answering questions beyond what's in the press release as another Detroit automaker.
Well, as most automakers in general.
Yeah.
I would argue that the German makers in general, because being an auto engineer is a respected profession in Germany, like being a doctor here. So they are proud of what they do. They're not muzzled by their communications people. And especially after the third beer, they will sometimes give you information that is only tangentially relevant, but really interesting.
In fairness, that applies to GM, that applies to the domestics too. You get them a few beers in, and they are much more candid. Like, who's not? But yes, I mean, you're right. We are
break loose of the communications professionals.
Most of them. There's a couple.
That's fair.
But yes, I mean, in fairness, the Volt cred, looking back, was basically built by 3 or 4 people.
Yes.
It wasn't even built. I mean, it wasn't built by GM per se, other than these people happen to work for the company, but it wasn't the strategy at the level that is happening today and under this team. It was a few guys that kind of looked at the initial reaction to Volt was fairly cynical, and credit to those 3 or 4 people who saw that and went, ooh, we gotta pivot, we gotta dig in on this. Okay, this is not gonna be as easy as we thought. And there were some really strange early conversations to that point, but they got it and they went with it. And I think to their credit, but also to their benefit, like, they launched and left with Volt. Once they put it in showrooms, a lot of that engagement waned. Yes. But they earned a huge amount over basically 3 years, from first unveiling to cars in showrooms. That was a lot of work, and it was not the usual formulaic work that happens in PR or marketing. It was much more engaged and touch and cheaper in a lot of ways. It was, we're coming out for the TED conference. We'll meet out in the back parking lot. Chelsea, go invite 10 of your closest friends to come test drive the Volt on the fly. Yeah. And like lots of weird little subversive, conspiratorial, in a good way, kinds of things that were not any extra expense really for GM, but were the type of engagement that was really needed for the audience at the time. And some of that is still needed. The scripty stuff comes off less well.
I agree, although I think this thing is so broad now and touching so many parts of the company that there may be less of a chance that could happen than a little pirate.
To that scale, for sure. Yes, but that general overall spirit of direct engagement and less high-level comms, which works really well for high-volume products, but less well for the stage of this market. Will be interesting to watch how they do it going forward.
Look at the coverage of the Lyric or of the EVgo announcement, and it was basically context-free. And
anyway. Because there wasn't that much information. And then I wasn't on the Cadillac media call, but I got text messages from others who were at the time going, oh my God, we're not learning anything that wasn't already in the press release. And I mean, I get it. And the posture is now just so defensive in some ways. And I understand, but it's also to their detriment in the long run.
Sure.
And they have a lot to be proud of, and they are clearly the U.S.
maker
who is doing the most in EVs. So own it and be willing and have the confidence to talk about it beyond the talking points.
I know. I mean, I will, to some degree, I will have a different opinion of this generation of GM, comms, marketing, PR, whatever folks, when they're able to fully claim 25 plus years of history in this space. I mean, they have been the leader multiple times. EV1 for sure, Volt, yes, first back into the fray, so on and so forth. But they struggle so much with how to talk about it without inviting the who killed the electric car kind of stuff. And yet I can think of 8 million ways to talk about it. And we did some of that in that 3-year Volt engagement period. But I mean, right before EV Day I had just done the trip from Oklahoma to Texas for Fully Charged with the EV1, towing it with the Audi. And Mark chimed in on Facebook again and said, oh, we just rebuilt an EV1. And like a couple weeks after that was this EV Day. And so I mentioned to a couple of the PR people that I had secretly hoped that car would be around on display somewhere. Like, if this is EV Day, let's celebrate decades of history. And every single one of them separately said, why the hell would we do that?
Why wouldn't you?
And it was a strange reaction for me, because you'd think I'd get a super PR answer, but no, it was just like, why? Why would we do that? It would only be bad for us.
I think the film was so successful that it has permanently altered the DNA of the company. Honestly.
I still say this is a cultural phenomenon that goes way past cars. Nobody wants to engage. Everyone wants to deflect. Right. Nobody wants to service. Everyone wants to manage. It's not about communication. It's about controlling the narrative.
Right. Right. But there's ways to, like I say all the time, if I can get past that, because everyone who kind of goes, I will never buy a GM product again. Well, shame on you. Because, you know, that was 25 years ago.
I had a Twitter commenter say just the other day, well, GM is off the list because they supported the anti-carb effort, which stunned me. And I was sort of, well, so did Toyota. And there's actually a pressure group set up just for Toyota's participation in that. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's off too.
Right. Well, but at least that's a more recent reference. So I'll take that. At least if you have a reason and it's in the last couple of years, fine. If it's because EV1, no. I mean, there's so much that has happened since, a whole different crew of people, you know, a few leftover engineers who do great work, but it's a different GM in a lot of ways. And same for all the other manufacturers that crush their cars. So yes, there's a little bit of like, okay, fine. I understand everyone has their bias, but let's call them what they are and base them on something recent.
Which takes us to Tesla fanboys, which I'm not going to address.
Yeah, no, that is a different show. So
good night,
yes. Where shall we find you? Where shall people find you?
Yes.
I am on Twitter. I will spell it because I have an unspellable and unpronounceable surname. John Voelcker, all one word, John. V like Victor. Oh, it's on my name. V like Victor, Oelcker. And you can find my stuff on thedrive.com, on chargedevs.com, some older stuff I did on greencarreports.com, and various other places as well.
Yes. And we will put links to both of the articles we were talking about today in the show notes.
Thank you as always for the chance. It's always an enormous pleasure to talk to you guys.
Thank you.
I mean, we should just do this all the time, but yes.
Well, once Chelsea and I get hired to run GM comms for electric cars, that'll...
Right?
From your
There was
lips.
an April Fool's joke to that effect once.
Yeah, that's a comms department I'd like to deal with.
Well, we stopped doing April Fool's jokes altogether. Do you remember the Volt article that got picked up?
Yes.
Yes. I wrote a very, very, very dry article talking about how the NRA was now fully in support of electric cars because they were pressing legislation to require power out so every one of their members could charge their personal railguns under their Second Amendment rights. And it got picked up by a syndicator.
I'm sure there's a market for that.
Let's just say it was a very unpleasant day for my boss.
Oh.
Yes. Well, because I am known to enjoy some torque and performance, there was once an April Fool's joke that GM was coming out with an SS version of the Volt, which in fairness, I have long been asking for, and that I was going back to GM to run that program. And one of our favorite comms people from that era posted it, and it grew some legs as well. And so both of us ended up having to do some explaining.
Nice. Yeah, because GM doesn't like it when you talk about made-up products that they may or may not be making.
Well, and it was like, oh my God, Chelsea's going back to GM. And because it came from a GM person, it grew some legs. And I mean, it was terribly fun, and I miss those days.
Ouch. You can follow Chelsea at EV Chels on Twitter, and Chels anywhere else that people should look. Anything
here?
Transport Treehouse.
And we now have a standalone podcast feed. So if those that don't want to listen to the rest of What Drives Us, and how could you not, but we get it. So you can now find Transport Treehouse by itself.
Absolutely. We have a playlist that we'll post links to in the show note, and you can go to anchor.fm / Transport Treehouse to pick up those audio podcasts, or you can pick them up on your favorite podcast app, Spotify and whatnot. So yay. More market penetration. It sounds so male when I say it. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
Because penetration.
Yeah. Is that what it is?
If we're going to state the obvious.
I'm sorry. Okay. So thanks for watching. John, thanks so much for being here. Chelsea, we'll see you soon back in the treehouse.